Then I start with our presentation. My name is Wibke Werner. Good morning, everybody. I give a first overview about our rent cap in Berlin, and my colleague Rainer Wild will add some comments afterwards, and then we answer your questions at the round table. Strategies against skyrocketing rents, rent control system and market rents. First, before I go over on the rent cap in Berlin, I will give you a little overview about the situation in Berlin right now. We are 3.7 million in Berlin, inhabitants in Berlin. Every year, Berlin grows by 30,000 to 40,000 inhabitants, which has some influences on the rental market, of course. We have altogether 1.9 million apartments, of which 1.6 million are rental apartments. Berlin is a rental city. 85% of Berlin populations live in Berlin for rent. Maybe some interesting more facts. The housing cost burden is between 33% and 44% of the household income. That is what the Berlin tenants have to afford for living in their apartments. The average rent in existing tenancies is €6.72. This is an increase by 18% in the last 5 years. The average asking rent for new leases, if you have a new apartment and sign a new lease, at the moment, in average, €11 a square meter is always net rent without heating costs and running costs. The asking rent for new leases increased by 30.5% in the last 5 years, so the rents are rising. It's not that our policies on federal level and Berlin level is not doing anything. They were active in the last years, so what did we do? Or what did Germany do? For example, on federal laws, they introduced a Mietpreisbremse for Germany. And with the Mietpreisbremse, if you sign a contract, then the rent may not be more than 10% above the local cooperative rent. This we have already, this Mietpreisbremse, also in Berlin. In federal law, we also have the improvement of modernization regulations. After modernization, the landlord is allowed to raise the rents, and now the rent increase after modernization has been reduced and cut off at capping limits. Before, until last year, it was 11% of the cost. The landlord was investigating in renovations. He could put over on the rent. Now it's only 8%, and the rent is not increased more than €3 per square meter in 6 years. So there's a little bit better improvement. Also, we have an Alliance for Affordable Housing and Construction that was founded in Germany. The housing benefit, a financial support for tenants, Wohngeld, was increased, and the funds for social housing were increased also. So Germany gives money for affordable housing. What did we do in Berlin, the Berlin Parliament? Social housing development was introduced again in 2014. And also the misapproval of housing was forbidden by law if like Airbnb and empty apartments is like a punishment for this. And a very interesting point is a cooperation agreement with the municipal housing companies has been concluded. We have 6 municipal housing companies in Berlin, and these companies are only allowed to increase rents to a lesser extent and have to rent out 60% of their apartments rent to low-income households. Our municipal housing companies have about 300,000 apartments. So even though there were some actions, it doesn't work. The rents keep on rising in Berlin. So now we have this new idea, the Mietendeckel, I say rent cap. And this is right now, it's a draft bill which is in discussion. The Left Party and the Social Democrats had like a bill which is discussed right now. It's still not a law yet, that you have to keep in mind. The plans are that this rent cap is expected to come into force in January 2020, so next year, and will apply for 5 years. It's a public regulation, which is important, since the state of Berlin has a legislative authority only for public law regulation. The civil law and the rent law is in the responsibility of the federal government on the Germany level. Hope you understand it. It's a very important point, because these are the criticisms right now at this meeting. Lots of people say Berlin doesn't have the power to pass that law. We have another opinion. We say as long as it is a public regulation, we do have that possibility. And the rent cap is a public regulation because of following points. A public office, the district offices probably, is responsible for enforcement. I will come back to it later. The rental values, they are set. And the public sector can impose a fine on violations on the law. If the landlords don't keep that rent cap, then they can put a punishment on it and ask for, how do you say punishment? Strafe. Yes. How does the rent cap work? The initial rent, which is the rent is we have a view on, is the rent due on June 18th, 2019. That was a point at the day where the Linke Party in Berlin has published a paper with the basic ideas of the rent cap, and they said whenever this law will get in power, it will. You have to look at the rent that are due on June 18th, 2019. And they have made a table of rent values that define the framework for rent increases and developing. Pretty simple system, actually. I will show you the table in the next sheet. How was this table made? They took the average rent from 2013, which were taken from the Berliner Mietspiegel 2013. Berliner Mietspiegel is an overview in Berlin about the rents. I have nothing.
That's interesting. You haven't seen the presentation at all? No? No?
Well, I read it anyway. You're wondering why I'm a so good English speaker. Anyway, so the basis of this table I will show you on the next sheet was the Berlin Mietspiegel 2013. Berliner Mietspiegel is an overview about the paid rents in existing tenancies. And they put these rents, these average rents, and these table values were supplemented by wage development. So you can't just freeze on the rents from 2013, so you put the supplement with the wage development on it. Finally, this table came out. This is right now the idea. You see these housing after building age of the apartment and the equipment. We differ between these units. You see the building age is kind of from 1918 till 2013, either with central heating and with bath, or without central heating and without bath. It differs some ways. And you see on the right side, these are the net rent cap, the stops. How is modernization, energetic modernization will be found into these tables. An increase of these table values by a maximum of €1.40 per square meter is possible if the landlord has carried out a modernization in the last 15 years. So if the last 15 years there was an energetic renovation, then the landlord can go to the federal office and can say, I want a higher level in this table. If the landlord wants to modernize in future after this law has taken place, he must report this to the public office, and the table value can then be increased by €1 per square meter, and further modernizations are to be approved by the public office. So he has to tell the public office then what he's planning to do, and this public office has then to decide if they agree with these modernizations, allocations or not. For example, measures to achieve the climate protection goals must be approved by that public office, or measures to which the landlord is obliged by law where he has to do. Then the public office has to say okay, and he can raise the rents a little bit more than these table values. How do we apply the rent cap? It's very simple, three situations. The rent of June 18th is below the table value. That's the first option. Then rent increases are still possible. It's not that they are frozen at all. As long as you're under these table values, you can still increase, but only by maximum 1.3% per year and only up to the table's top value. So the table top's value, that's the maximum. Second option, the rent is above that table value already, the rent from June 18th. Then the rent can, at least from our idea and from the draft bill right now, the rent can then be reduced if the rent is more than 30% of the household income and the dwelling has a reasonable housing size. This is a very hard discussion right now about this point, about reducing the rents after the law is getting into action, and there's a hard fight about it, and we hope we will get some kind of reducing the rent in this, leave it in this Our mayor said in an interview some days ago that he doesn't want this rent reduction in that law. He just wants to stop rent increases. But we think it's very important to have this rent reduction into this law because there are lots of rents that were not legally combined. How do you say? Were checked. So this is a very interesting point. Third option. After the rent cap come into force next year, a new lease is signed. You go to Berlin, find a new apartment, and sign a new lease. Then the tabletop values applies. That is then the main the rent you have to pay. It's interesting that then moving to another apartment could be positive for you because then your rent might be lower than in an existing tenancy. In an existing tenancy, you might be with your rent above this table value, but you are not allowed to reduce the rent because your rent is maybe not more than 30% of your household income. So then it might be very effective to choose to find a new apartment. It's kind of interesting what that means in the practice then. So that is how it works. What is our opinion to this law? Well, of course, we support this law. We also try to give some ideas how it could work, and we have some following suggestions for improvement, though. The basis for the tables, like I told you, was the rental level from 2013. We say it should better be the rental level from 2011. Why? Because at this point of time, the vacancy was still at 3% in 2011, indicating a balanced housing market. So we say as long as you have 3% of empty apartments, then it's kind of a relaxing housing market. So that should be the basis for the tables. Also, the modernizations must be approved of the district officer, like I told you. And we think the approval criteria are very soft, so that probably at that moment, all modernizations are expected to be approved. So in order to achieve a rental dampening effect, even on modernizations, then the approval criteria must be tightened. There must be clear facts to prove these modernizations. And lowering the rent required at the moment that the table values is exceeded and tenants pay more than 30% of the household income for the rent. We think it's not the best way to define that lowering rents. The reference to income is atypical in the system of a rent cap. So we think it would be better to have a reference to objective criteria, say a reduction on the rent is possible if the table value is exceeded by more than 10% or 15%, so that the income of the household doesn't play any role for this question. And another problem we see, and we really have to find a solution for this, who will execute the law? Right now, in the first draft, the idea was that the district offices should check and reduce the rents, so that the tenants go to the district offices and ask for rent reduction. Now, in the second paper, the execute should be done by the state-owned Bank of Berlin. In both cases, either district offices or state-owned Bank of Berlin, we have the problem we need lots more staff and well-trained staff. The persons who work in these offices are right now probably have big difficulties to prove these rents. So much from my side. Now, Rainer will add some points.
So we have only 10 minutes, Wibke, so I disclaim for more words, and I add your in the workshop. So
in the workshop. Thank you for your attention.